My normal page turner is in Nashville this weekend, so I had to replace it with something electronic that I'm never quite sure whether it's going to work. As I think everybody knows, this year is the 150th anniversary of the first year of the Civil War, and so we thought that we would, can everybody see that? We want to try to cut the part of the lights. So we thought that we would have a couple of programs this year on Civil War related topics and see how they go, and if they're popular enough, we may have a couple more over the remaining 4 years of the anniversary. If not, you'll never hear about it again. So I'm going to do a presentation this morning or this afternoon on the beginning of the war, what led up to the war nationally and locally, and really the first year of the war up into the Battle of Shiloh in early 1862. Since that's the 150th anniversary of the first year. We're going to have a program later this year, August. Peggy, is that the right? I can't remember the date. But Scott Sanders is going to do a history of Antioch College in the Civil War, which ought to be really interesting. And I'm going to try to avoid stepping on any of his toes. So if there's a big vacuum in part of this program in the beginning of the war on what was going on in Antioch, that's the reason for it. And then at the end of the year, we're going to have another program on anti-war sentiment, peace sentiment in Ohio during the Civil War with a professor from Wilmington College, who's a well-known expert in that area speaking. So with that, I'm going to force everybody to try to remember a little bit of high school history. It was a little tough for me too. What I've done here is I've done a couple of events that really were leading up to the American Civil War, and then in yellow or green underneath each one, I've put in what was happening in this area at the time, so you just get a little feel of what's going on where. And I think the main point of this is not so much what these events were or what was happening specifically. I mean, specifically what the Missouri Compromise in 1820 was, but more the fact that you see this building, and the building starts and it gets faster and faster and faster as we get into the 1850s, and then 1860 and 1861, we'll see that it's almost inevitable. It's just moving up to the American Civil War. And I started with the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 because it was adopted by under the Articles of Confederation before the U.S. Constitution was adopted, and it obviously was one of the primary points of it. It was really almost like the Constitution for development of the Northwest Territory, but it prohibited slavery and involuntary servitude. It also, though, which a lot of people don't know or don't remember, had a fugitive slave provision in it, even in 1787, that was put there to discourage slaves from fleeing the South and into a territory where slavery was prohibited. The Missouri Compromise was a political solution worked out over more and more. Well, let me back up a second. One thing about the Constitution. The Constitution was actually adopted by Congress the convention in 1787. It actually went into effect. It was adopted in 1788. And it had a compromise in it to try to appease the southern states, which had relatively small populations as compared to the northern states, but had slaves. And the northern states who felt that only voters should be counted in voting in taxes, in federal taxes. And what that was the 3/5 compromise, which said that a slave counts as 3/5 of a person for purposes of federal voting, for voting for Congress, for the House and Senate, or not the Senate, obviously the House, and for tax purposes too. And so this was an embedding of the concept of slavery in the Constitution, where it didn't otherwise exist one direction or the other. So the Missouri Compromise was a further effort to try to balance the southern states and the northern states as the westward expansion occurred. In particular, in 1803, the U.S. Purchased Louisiana Territory. So we had now had a system in place for bringing new states into the Union. That was really set up with the Northwest Ordinance, acting as a precedent. And we had all this new territory with the Louisiana Territory, and there was a lot of concern that the balance was going to be off between North and South. So the compromise was basically that Missouri was going to, the first part of it, the reason why it's called the Missouri Compromise is that the state of Missouri was going to come in as a slave state, but Maine was coming in as a free state. Keep that balance in Congress exactly the same. The other thing that the Missouri Compromise said was going further west to try to solve this problem. Going forward, they're going to draw a line along the bottom line of Missouri, 36 degrees, 30 minutes. And that was going to extend west through the whole Louisiana Territory. And states that came in above that line would come in free. States that came in below that line would come in slave. Thomas Jefferson said about this, and he had about another 5 years to live after this was adopted, it's like a fire bell in the night. It's the warning sign that there's problems and they're going to get worse. And he was right. Well, what happened after this, other than just the railroad coming to the Yellow Springs? Well, if you think about the Mexican War in the 1840s, what resulted from that? The entire southwest of what's today the United States got brought into the country. California got brought into the country. And so we've got this whole problem again. And the line, that Missouri Compromise line, if you drew it straight across, would mean Southern California was going to be slave and Northern California was going to be free. And it really just threw everything off. There was concern about Texas itself. How big is Texas going to be? Texas was clearly coming in as a slave state. So in something that only politicians could come up with, the Compromise of 1850, Henry Clay from Kentucky was one of the prime architects, along with Douglas from Illinois, Stephen Douglas. It was a package of pieces of legislation. And California was going to be admitted entirely as a free state, and that's what California really wanted. Texas would give up some of the territory it had claimed, and those that territory, which had the makings of New Mexico and Utah, would be allowed to vote. Popular sovereignty would be entitled to vote on whether they were going to come in as free or slave states. And that was really an introduction of something that would come back in spades a couple of years later. The slave trade, but not slavery, was prohibited in Washington, D.C. And I should have said, when I said that Texas gave up territory, not surprisingly, they got something for it, and the U.S. government assumed the debts of the Republic of Texas. So the whole country agreed to pay off Texas debts. And the last thing was the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. And in some ways, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 did as much as anything else, I think, to bring about the Civil War, because it caused people who were in the North, in particular, who were otherwise ambiguous maybe about slavery in the South, to become more and more actively involved. And we'll talk about that a little bit. Okay, you can see with the dates, these things are happening more frequently. 1854, Kansas, Nebraska are about to come in. Big decision about what's going to happen, because although they're north of the Missouri Compromise line, they're going to throw off, if they both come in as free states, they're going to throw off the balance. The South, which has got a disproportionate representation in Congress in some ways, you could say, because their voters, each vote is worth more than one vote because of the counting of the slaves, are dead set against it. And basically, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which Stephen Douglas also was involved in, really was the appeal or repeal of the Missouri Compromise. And they extended that idea of popular sovereignty to these two states, and they said, okay, the states themselves will be entitled to vote whether they're going to be free or not. Well, that led to what's generally known as Bloody Kansas, because with both sides seeing a prize here, depending on the vote in the state, representatives, I guess is a kind way of saying it, from both sides flooded into Kansas to try to sway the vote one way or the other, and there were fights and there were border ruffians and all sorts of things. It was a big mess. And one of the men whose name will come up here in a few minutes, who was there, was John Brown. He had some of his training growing up and was a wool merchant near Akron. The Dred Scott decision pushed things even further along. It was a decision of the Supreme Court that there was always been some ambiguity about whether if an enslaved person who was legally enslaved in the South was brought to a free state like Ohio, what's the person's status? Is that person free? Is that person not? Dred Scott was actually a slave belonging to an army officer who traveled around. He was in Minnesota. He was in the South. He was, actually the officer died, and the officer's widow was renting out Dred Scott, and Scott decided to take his case to court, and he had been in Minnesota. He was free according to his position. Well, the Supreme Court disagreed with that and found him not to apply, and it went way beyond that, and it wasn't even necessary. They concluded that they just didn't have jurisdiction over the case. It was a state matter, and then they went on to say, well, even so, it's not enough if you go to a free state to have your freedom. And that was national recognition. We had those same sorts of things around here. Robert Patterson, who had the mill over in Clifton, brought his slaves from Kentucky early in the century, and eventually settled in Dayton, where he mostly stayed. And there were fights in the taverns in Dayton as they were trying to work out whether those African Americans were free or slave, and whether it made a difference about whether he had an intention of going back to Kentucky or staying in Ohio. So it was the process of trying to understand and work out the law that was going on here. I want to mention a couple of things. I'll talk about them a little bit further in a few minutes, but the Addison White Rescue and the Oberlin Wellington Rescue were some wild times in Ohio, and Addison White in particular was a more local event that really came out of the Fugitive Slave Act and the reaction of people in this area to what that law said. Because the Fugitive Slave Act, among other things, said that anyone who assisted, gave food or lodging to an escaped slave was subject to a 6 months in jail or $1,000 penalty. It'll force the federal marshals, if a slave owner came to a federal court or and asked a federal marshal to serve a warrant to return an escaped slave, it forced them to do it, and it had a provision that the marshals could form posses from local citizens and force local citizens to serve in those posses to recover. The last thing I want to mention from the 1850s is John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, and I think probably everybody remembers that Brown was clearly radical is probably a kind way of doing it, saying it, but he raised some men, and his idea was to, with this small group of men, to take the federal arsenal at Harpers Ferry, Virginia, and distribute the arms that were there, and through that to encourage an uprising of the slaves of Virginia. I'll talk a little bit more about it in a few minutes, but it was sort of the last of the straws. And as I said, it starts moving fast. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. 1860 in December, November he's elected president. December, South Carolina secedes. March of the next year, he's inaugurated as president. First thing he does is try to resupply Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The South Carolinians start firing on Fort Sumter, which has to surrender, and the next day after the surrender, Lincoln calls for 75,000 troops for 90 days to put down the rebellion. This is not a very clear picture. I'm not sure it serves much point, but I was trying to show, you can see the slave states that would become most of the Confederacy, the free states in the north in California, the undeveloped territory, which is this green in Kansas and Nebraska, where all the bloodshed was. This man is interesting. I don't know if any of you have read the book that came out a year or two ago on a band of rivals. I'm blocking against the name of it. It's the book about Abraham Lincoln's cabinet and how they were his rivals, and he brought them into the cabinet, and they sort of fought among themselves a lot. But how he a team of rivals. That's what it was. A team of rivals. How they worked together. This was one of Ohio's representatives in that group, Salmon P. Chase, a lawyer from Cincinnati. He had served in the U.S. Senate, was elected governor of Ohio in 1855. He served until 1860. He was head of the Liberty Party. He was definitely on the radical side of what became known as the abolitionists, and he had some personality quirks. He was fairly confident in not only his own abilities, but his own how much the population liked him. He thought he should have been nominated for president instead of Lincoln at the 1860 convention. But he also defended a lot of slaves who had made it north and then been arrested under the Fugitive Slave Act as well on a pro bono basis. I'd like to talk a little bit about the Underground Railroad here. You can see this was from a clipping from an early newspaper. And these two are not real local, but John and Jean Rankin from Ripley, Ohio, whose house still stands on a hill overlooking the Ohio River, and was a beacon for escaping slaves, as was a man by the name of Parker, who had a house down in Ripley, and Ripley was just an active station, if you will, on the Underground Railroad. A few years ago, it's probably been 10 years ago now, we had a speaker from Ripley come up and talk about what was going on there, Ann Hagedorn, who wrote a great book called Beyond the River. Well, it wasn't just Ripley, it was local as well. Not so much Yellow Springs. We've really not found a lot of evidence that there was any active Underground Railroad in Yellow Springs. It doesn't mean it was there, because it wasn't always publicized, but it certainly wasn't as well as an active a location as Selma. And Selma, this is on the the railroad to Virginia to Columbus that's running in front of it. I don't know if this is going to help anybody, but we should know where Selma is because it's not very far away, but lots of times Yellow Springs doesn't necessarily acknowledge other places. and so here is Yellow Springs, Springfield, and Selma is right there, right off of 42. It was on Old 42 between Cedarville and South Charleston. And this was a place that was very, very active on the Underground Railroad. It was said that the name Selma was known in the South as being a major stop, and the main reason was the Quakers that were there. And I hope we get a little bit, for anybody who was here at the last program, I hope we get a little bit of this history of the last program, and we really didn't, but the Green Plain Monthly Meeting, which this is a 1843 meeting house there, it was a fairly significant Quaker settlement to begin with, and I'm not an expert on Quaker histories, but the Orthodox and the Hicksites had broken off. This was the Hicksite meeting house. The Hicksites then broke into two pieces with the Congregationalists, and the Congregationalists were very, very strong anti-slavery proponents. And so they went their own way for a while, and it was that Congregational community meeting that was the most active in the Underground Railroad. Some of the names which you may recognize: Howell and Burton and Thorne. Julie Cady, she's a Howell, and they were among the very active abolitionists Quakers running the Underground Railroad through Selma. This is Mary Thorne. Mary Thorne and her husband William were active conductors. They would move. The route was generally through Xenia to Selma, up 42 was now 42 to Selma, trying to dodge Cedarville because Cedarville was a hotbed of pro-slavery sentiment. And then from Selma into Springfield, and there was, I'm sure there were many people, but there was a Charles Stout in Springfield who ran a livery stable, who was a major station operative. And it's hard to find out a lot of information about the Underground Railroad because by its very nature it was secret, and a lot of what we know, or the pieces that we know, came from a man named William Siebert, who in the 1890s went around and collected stories of the Underground Railroad from people who remembered or who had even been active, and Mary Thorne was one of the people he talked to. Now this group happens to be from Oberlin, Ohio, but it brings up, well, let me back up a second. I almost forgot something I wanted to mention, because just to show how radical that Selma Green Plain congregation was, this is a resolution they adopted in 1850 after the adoption of the Fugitive Slave Act. They were basically saying that they were going to go ahead and help fugitive slaves just as they had always done, in defiance of all the enactments of all the governments on earth. If it be really a constitutional obligation, they said that all who live under the government shall be kidnappers and slave catchers for southern tyrants. We go for revolution. This means to be in keeping with God's will. That's pretty militant Quakers. So this heat is building. This was in 1840s into the 50s. where the Underground Railroad was active in Selma. This actually obviously happened in 1850 when they adopted the resolution. And things were mixed. It wasn't all one way or the other. Like I say, Cedarville tended to be supported slavery, and a young man who wasn't old enough to vote yet, who would go on to some greatness during the Civil War, and was actually attended Antioch College for a year. So, Scott, I'm taking this away from you, but I'm trying to avoid too much. J. Warren Kiefer. And Kiefer is talking about the presidential campaign of 1856. He said, I made in Clark, and again, he's not old enough to vote, I made in Clark and Greene counties, Ohio, about 50 campaign speeches for Fremont, who was the Freestyle candidate. The excitement being so high that mobbing or egging was not uncommon. The pro-slavery people called Fremont supporters abolitionists, the most opprobrious name they could conceive they could use. Colonel William Furray, now living in Columbus, of about my age, also made many speeches in the same campaign, and we were joint recipients of at least one egging at Clifton, Ohio. So, well, this takes us up to 1857, and as I mentioned, this is a group from Oberlin, but I want to tell you a little bit about Addison White. And Addison White escaped slavery in Flemingsburg, Kentucky, and managed to make his way to Mechanicsburg, Ohio. Now, Mechanicsburg was a little bit like Selma. It was a very strong abolitionist sentiment, and he was working on the farm of a man by the name of Udney Hyde, who lived there. And word got back to, apparently not quietly enough, because word got back to Flemingsburg that he was there, and his former master went to the courthouse and got federal marshal to raise a party of I think there were 9 of them, who came up to recapture White and take him back to Flemingsburg. Well, White, how much of the stories, which of these stories are exactly correct, who knows, but at least the best story that I read said that White barricaded himself in an attic room with only one entrance and a ladder to it. And he was armed with a shotgun, a rifle, a revolver, a knife, and an axe. So he wasn't going to be taken very easily. And in fact, so you can see these 9 marshals all down below, sort of saying who's going to volunteer to go up. And finally, one of the marshals stuck his head up, and again, the story goes, White shot at him, but it hit the shotgun that the marshal had and bounced off, and so he wasn't harmed. But they, meanwhile, the daughter of Hyde, the farm owner, had gone into Mechanicsburg and raised a crowd, and they came back and they were taunting and making fun of the marshals, and so they left without Addison White and returned to Cincinnati, where they swore out warrants for the arrest of Hyde and 3 others who had assisted him under the Fugitive Slave Act because they both resisted the federal officer and had obviously given aid to an escaped slave. So they went back to Mechanicsburg with their warrants and 14 guys this time, and arrested Hyde and the 3 others they had warrants for. And at this point, apparently, for some reason, the citizens of Mechanicsburg thought they were going to head towards Urbana, which county seat, because it's Champaign County. But instead, the marshals with the prisoners started off cross country. Down, and Mechanicsburg isn't that far out of Clark County, so down towards Clark County. And that threw the town into a tizzy because they were convinced that the marshals were taking them back to Kentucky and were going to lynch these guys, these 4 guys in Kentucky once they got across the river. So the citizenry of Champaign County got all alarmed and started following them. Got the sheriff or got the judge to issue a warrant of habeas corpus, requiring the marshals to produce their prisoners and explain that they had the right to the prisoners. And they obviously realized they were coming into Clark County, so they went to the Clark County sheriff, did the same thing. The Clark County sheriff takes a posse out, and they finally catch up with these guys just outside of South Charleston, about half a mile outside of South Charleston. And the marshals, there's a little bit of an altercation, and they shoot the Clark County sheriff. And in fact, they thought he was dead. He survived and apparently never really fully recovered. So at that time, they're going on their way from South Charleston. So they send word the pursuers send word to the Greene County sheriff, and the Greene County sheriff raises a group and takes after the escaping slave catchers, and finally catches up with them at Lumberton, which Lumberton is maybe 2 buildings and a sign on 68 right above the Warren County line. And so by this time the estimate is there's 200 or 300 people pursuing the 14 marshals. And so as one commentator said, this all caused intense excitement and aroused great indignation. So they stopped the Greene County sheriff and the crowd stopped the marshals, released the prisoners, and took actually let the marshals go. I think they were on bail, but because they were being accused of assault. And they returned, they went back to Cincinnati, got more warrants, not only for the original 4 people, but now it says for a large number of citizens of Mechanicsburg, Urbana, Springfield, and Xenia, including the county court judges. And so it went on, and in fact what happened, and this is almost what happened in Oberlin as well, in the end there were two test cases taken. One was of Hyde, and the other was a guy by the name of Brand, and that's a prominent Champaign County family. They're still prominent Champaign County family. And the jury refused to indict. So they're in no man's land. This is going on for a year, and finally, when the account says everybody was getting tired of the legal maneuvering, and the former owner of Addison White offered to sell him to Champaign County, basically, for $1,000, which the citizens raised $1,000 and bought his freedom, basically. And again, one of the commentators says, curious and interesting feature of the probate court records of Champaign County is the deed for Addison White. But Addison White went on, he joined the 54th Massachusetts Infantry in the Civil War, which everybody knows is the movie Glory was based on the exploits of 1st African American Regiment in the U.S. Army, and lived at least into the 1880s. I'm not sure how long afterwards in Mechanicsburg. So those were exciting times in 1857, and in 1858, virtually the same thing happened in Oberlin. And if we think Selma is radical, Oberlin is really radical, and part of that really goes back to the 1830s, because the Lane Seminary in Cincinnati, which had been a hotbed of abolitionist anti-slavery thought, had a schism. They split apart. A lot of the more radical students who were opposed to slavery left en masse and went to Oberlin and became students at Oberlin in 1833. and that sort of set the radical tone for Oberlin. And again, another escaped slave, John Price, had managed to make it to Oberlin. Federal marshals were sent to arrest him, and not to arrest him, but to take him back. And he was taken to Wellington, which is nearby Oberlin. And there was a big group in Oberlin that went after him, after the marshals, and they picked up more people in Wellington at the railroad station. And they took John Price back. They managed to get John Price to Canada. They actually got him out of the country, but 37 of the rescuers were indicted. This is a small group of the rescuers, and these rescuers were white. There were former slaves who were free. There was at least one escaped slave in the group. So it was a big, well mixed group, and they had the local sheriff again arrest the marshal and the deputies, and there was a big trial as a result. 2 people were chosen to be the test case, and they ended up being convicted. One spent 60 days in jail, and the other spent 20 days in jail. Obviously, the judge was letting them off easy. But this more so than what's sometimes called the Greene County Rescue, the Addison White case, made national news, and lots of issues in the South over it, lots of issues in the North over it. So. You mentioned John Brown's raid, U.S. Arsenal in Harper's Ferry. John Brown arrested by Robert E. Lee, ironically, who took a detachment of Marines to Harper's Ferry. Here's a question for Scott or me. This is Edwin Coppock, who was one of John Brown's raiders who was hanged. Was he an Antioch student or not? I've read that his brother was an Antioch student, and I've also read that he was an Antioch student. In fact, I don't know if I've got it. J. Warren Kiefer mentions, when he's writing about his year at Antioch, says that they had a debating society, and that's how he learned a lot of his politics. And he said only one of the members of that debating society went to the gallows. And there was Edwin
There's
Coppock.
a topic in the early, but I don't think it's him.
I found another account that said it might have been actually his brother. There were the two brothers who were they were from Iowa, actually on the raid, and then the third wasn't. So, and it may be that Kiefer's writing 50 years afterwards. He's mixing his stories, but he definitely says it was.
Someone that did was Mary Ross.
This Coppock.
Mary Ross that was definitely executed, and he went to school with him.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
I can't imagine you mix this into one.
yeah. Well, and hung. Well, yeah, that's right. Ross was hung. That's right. Okay. So, election of 1860. Lincoln, 52% of the vote. Douglas, 42.3%. Stephen Douglas, the author of the Compromise of 1850. That triggers fairly quickly, at least on his inauguration, bombardment of Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Lincoln said he was going to reinforce the fort, supply the fort, basically. The South Carolinians said, no, you're not, and started opening fire from all sides. And it was commanded by, fort was commanded by Robert Anderson, whose brother would become governor of Ohio at the end of the Civil War, Charles Anderson. So they didn't have much choice. Anderson surrenders Fort Sumter. Supposedly, the story is that the Ohio Senate was in session, and when they announced the news, somebody in the balcony yelled, "Glory to God." It turned out it was a visiting lady from Massachusetts who was an abolitionist and saw what was going to happen. So this was April 12th through 13th, 14th. April 15th, Lincoln called for 75,000 troops for 90 days to put down the rebellion. That resulted in 4 more states, including Virginia, seceding from the Union. In Columbus, this man was governor, William Dennison. Dennison was a railroad man, not much of a military man, but he offered to Lincoln, telegraphed Lincoln, that he would supply, the state of Ohio would supply all 75,000 volunteers if nobody else did. And in fact, he raised 20 companies within 3 days. And when you think about Ohio, you think about it being a strongly northern state, obviously, but just look at this map. Kentucky and Virginia all the way up there to East Liverpool, to the Pennsylvania line. So Ohio had 400 miles of border with states that had either seceded, in the case of Virginia or Kentucky, threatening to secede, and at least some of the people would eventually secede. And Ohio didn't have much of a military system, and this is probably true of most of the states. There were a few companies, and in fact it was Salmon P. Chase had really done a lot to promote the militia, or at least to try to renovate the militia. There were a few companies like this was the Cincinnati Rover Guards, who were more of a dress parade type of thing. It was more of a social club than anything else. And in fact, Kiefer about this says, because Kiefer was a member of one of these units from Springfield and then became a staff officer, he said, "We staff officers wore good clothes, much tinsel, gaudy crimson scarves, golden epaulets, bright swords with glistening scabbards, rode horses in a gallop on parade occasions and muster days, yet knew nothing really military, certainly but little useful for war. We knew a little of company drill and of the handling of the old-fashioned musket." To your point, here's a member of the Springfield Zouaves wearing what's clearly an Ohio militia uniform. This is probably the state seal right here. And these 20 companies that first showed up, I mean, almost overnight, they started going into Columbus. The very first one into Columbus was the Springfield Zouaves. And we have Marion Ross, I forgot his name. We have Lysander Tully's, the principal of Yellow Springs High School, who was in that company. Devereaux Nicholas Badger, who maybe if we do another one of these programs on Yellow Springs in the Civil War later in the war, we'll talk about some of his exploits, which were pretty amazing. A really interesting person, one of the 2 Badger brothers who served in the Army from Yellow Springs. Guy by the name of Peters, who was teaching school in Clifton, also was a member of that company. They were incorporated into a regiment that became the 2nd Ohio Regiment. The first 20 companies became the first Ohio Regiment, the 2nd Ohio Regiment, and they were sent almost immediately towards Washington, because Washington at this point was even further into the southern states than southern Ohio was. And there was a lot of concern about what was going to happen at Washington. There were, by the way, let's see here. What I've been able to figure out, there were nine Yellow Springs, Miami Township guys in this second regiment. So they get to Washington, or they get to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Actually, at Lancaster, Pennsylvania, they finally get uniforms. The day they arrive in Lancaster is the day, if you'll remember your history, the 6th Massachusetts Regiment, which is the first regiment to actually try to get to Washington after Virginia seceded, was fired on by citizens in Baltimore, and they had to turn back from there. They'd been dropped off the railroad station and had to turn back. So things were looking pretty dire. This is what they were armed with, or what they were wearing, and from the accounts, it was it was put together in a hurry. It wasn't very good cloth. They said that the material would practically wash away in a rainstorm, and the state really had nothing. And they had, but one thing that was a craze at the beginning of the war, that somebody got the idea this was what all the soldiers needed, and so ladies at home were making these even and sending, they called them the havelocks, and it's that white covering for the hat, and it was supposed to keep the sun off your neck, and apparently it was, although they were sent to the men, they mostly used them as washcloths and rags to clean their rifles and whatever. They weren't very you notice that if you can see that this guy who's got the belt plate through the private, it says OVM, and I think I brought a couple of plates, or at least one plate that says OVM on it. It stands for Ohio Volunteer Militia, and that's what most of the early Ohio troops were issued.
Dave, those hats did not look like what I'm used to seeing.
These were, the tall hats were really dress hats, and so, and what you're used to seeing Civil War soldiers wearing, those little sort of scrunched down ones in the front, that's what's called a 4-H cap or a fatigue cap. And so this was what you'd wear in the parades, although one of the most famous brigades in the Civil War, the Iron Brigade, wore those even when they were in the field. But they got rid of, they're not very practical. So those light 4-H caps are what really you see, or just black caps of one kind or another. This was a Dayton politician by the name of Robert Skank, who was put in command of the 1st and 2nd Ohio regiments, those first 2 regiments that came out of the state. I realized when I put this together, I've got a number of generals' pictures, but they start all looking alike. There really wasn't. And at Bull Run, Battle of Bull Run, July 21st, 1861, when the federal government had sort of a rude awakening of what was happening. Because remember, they raised these regiments to 75,000 men for 90 days, because the war is going to be over in 90 days. That's all it's going to take to put down the rebellion. And at Bull Run, just in Virginia, just outside of Washington, there was it started off as not a very big defeat, and then turned into a total rout, because these guys were just unexperienced. Both sides were inexperienced. They didn't know how to handle themselves. The generals didn't know how to handle themselves, and so the Union, Union retreat. Basically, they ran back to Washington, and you know the stories about the congressmen coming out in their buggies to watch the battle and heading back just about as fast, and a lot of them headed back out the Warrenton Turnpike, and the stone bridge right here is where the 1st and 2nd sort of guarded the retreat. They didn't make it into the main battle, but they were there at that stone bridge. Picture the stone bridge before it was destroyed. Well, once Lincoln and his advisors realized that it wasn't going to be over with in 90 days, they knew they were going to have to do something a little bit little bit more long-term. And so they asked for men to re-enlist for 3 years of the war. It was that being shorter, not longer. So if you enlisted for 3 years, or if the war was over earlier, you get let go. And they established recruiting camps across the country, including Camp Dennison. That's a little Miami railroad going down through the middle of Camp Dennison, straight down the bike path from Yellow Springs. One of the largest recruiting camps in the country. And in fact, when Dennison had put out the call for troops within the state of Ohio, Ohio's share of the 75,000 was 13,000 men. Dennison just kept accepting people in, and he ended up with 13,000, thousands about a regiment. So instead of ending up with the 13 regiments he needed, he ended up with 22 regiments. And he went ahead and kept the extra regiments in state service because he thought, and rightfully, that they were going to be needed. So they were being mostly recruited and trained down here, especially the ones that were for the 75,000, the first 13,000. In fact, they never saw any action until they were re-enlisted for 3 years. But the other regiments, the 16th through the 22nd regiments, which were under state control, Dennison had a point of view which said, and I had a quote someplace here, I don't know if I can put my hands on it really quickly, but that basically the best place for defending Ohio was in Western Virginia and Kentucky. And so, and Lincoln was Kentucky was on the dividing line. Remember, Virginia had gone. Kentucky was on the dividing line. And so Lincoln kept Dennison from sending any troops into, state troops into Kentucky, but not the case in Western Virginia. And this is called the awkward squad. This is the process of turning unexperienced recruits into a regiment. This is the way most of the Civil War fought, shoulder to shoulder. You think that's something from the Revolutionary War, but it was 2 ranks, touching elbows. The whole theory was to get as many muskets in as packed area as possible because you get the most firepower. You weren't even necessarily aiming much. It was to get a whole line of lead coming out at a level. This is just an example of what the local citizens in the county started doing to support the families of those who enlisted. This is Michael Donnelly, who's from Yellow Springs. Private and Company 12th Ohio Regiment. His family is entitled to the county funds appropriated for the benefit of county volunteers. Well, as I started to say, the 16th through 22nd regiments were sent by Dennison into Western Virginia. The 16th, which was made up of companies, if you think of a regiment being 10 companies, so about 1,000 men and about 10 companies of 100 men each. And those companies tended to be raised locally. So a particular man might decide that he was going to raise a company, and so he would go recruit, and he'd get his company, and then he'd get assigned to some regiment. And that's what happened with the 16th, although this was happening in a very compressed time period. This was a one company of the 16th Company F was being raised in Springfield by the man on the left here, Philip Kirshner, who you recognize the Kirshner name from around in this area. And he raised a number of men. I think there was maybe a total of 16 or 17 men from Yellow Springs and Miami Township in the 16th Regiment. This is, the 16th also had a company from the town I grew up in, Worcester, in northern Ohio. This is a group of those guys. Really a poor photograph, but photographs from that early in the war are really rare, and they're wearing just gray jackets. A number of Ohio troops went to the field in gray rather than blue. This is the man by the name of James Irvine from Mount Vernon, who commanded the 16th, the 90-day 16th. And so here's Western Virginia, and what Dennison decided to do. Well, Dennison and his military commander, a guy by the name of McClellan, who would become better known later on, they're going to take the railroad this way and the railroad this way, from Wheeling and from Parkersburg, and they're going to meet at Grafton, Virginia, where those two railroads come together. And really, it's the B&O Railroad, and it was the main link to Washington, and they want to protect the B&O Railroad, so that was what they were trying to do. There's McClellan, George McClellan. Ohio troops, not federalized yet, crossed the river into Virginia at Parkersburg and at Wheeling, basically. They link up with this man, whose name was Kelly, who commanded the 1st Loyal Virginia Regiment, because the northwest counties of Virginia were really not they wanted to secede for the most part, from Virginia. To arms, to arms. This is a Confederate poster. Drive back the insolent invaders who insult you by their presence on your soil. Our little band of volunteers have been forced from Philippi by the ruthless northern foe led on by traitors. Well, that was included the 16th Regiment, which included Western Yellow Springs. This is West Virginia was Western Virginia. It was in a separate state at this point. Was a wild mountainous country, and it was a lot of small groups fighting like this. This happens to be from Harper's Weekly, the the life of its day, and it's the 16th Ohio Regiment crossing a bridge in Western Virginia. Well, and I've told the story a little bit out of sequence because I wanted to follow the 1st and 2nd regiments to Bull Run, and that was in July. But in end of May, early June, these Ohio troops and an Indiana regiment were in Western Virginia, and in fact they engaged in what's generally called the first land battle of the Civil War in a place called Philippi, Virginia. And it was sometimes referred to as the Philippi races because basically the federal troops came in one side of town and the Confederates ran out the other side of town. But I want to take a couple of minutes here and just read some excerpts from a letter that was written to the newspaper in Worcester by a lawyer who was captain of the Worcester Company in the 16th Regiment. And it's written just a day or two after this fight, so it's about as current as you get there. He says, he talks about them leaving Columbus. We had a few days before been supplied with muskets, knapsacks, canteens, haversacks, trousers, and caps. So we presented the appearance of something like soldiers. They got to Wheeling, or actually to Bel Air on the Ohio side. And Colonel Irvine ordered us to go to the commissary, get 7 days' rations, be ready to move at daylight. We were ready by 6 o'clock, each man with 40 rounds of ammunition in his cartridge box and 1 day's ration in his haversack. In the forenoon of Tuesday, Captain Kirshner, this is the man from Springfield, and Captain Mills' companies were sent on foot 16 miles in our advance to protect a bridge a few miles east at Fairmont. One of Kirshner's men, about the middle of the day, accidentally discharged his gun, wounding himself in the arm so as to render amputation necessary and softly wounding 2 others. That's No, he wasn't from Yellow Springs. He was the first man from this area who was wounded. And oddly enough, I don't know who keeps track of these things. It was the first amputation done during the Civil War, and it was in part known because the man whose arm was amputated went on after the war to have a fairly large company making artificial arms. So, let's see. Up to this time, our march had been more like a triumphal procession than an invasion of an enemy's country. Everywhere, the people rushed to meet us, to welcome us, to feed us. There was even a more intensity of feeling and earnestness depicted on the countenances of the people when we entered Virginia. They seemed to have been worn down and depressed from anxiety and dread, and our presence seemed to give them a sense of relief. Although the counties through which we passed, the Union men were largely in the majority, the secessionists, owing to their forces consisting largely of reckless and desperate men, and their being sustained by the state government, had completely overawed them. Okay, then they talk about marching up to Philippi. Let's see. About 4 o'clock we halted and were told that we were within 1 mile of Philippi. We waited a short time for the rear to close up and then received the command forward. We had not yet been ordered to load. We advanced a few hundred yards when we heard a musket fired to the right and the front, followed quickly by the discharge of a cannon. We had all loaded in the morning before starting, but owing to the rain, had been ordered to pull out our loads because the water would get down the barrels and make the powder not fire. To draw our loads at midnight before resuming our march. One company in our rear, and at this time obscuring from review, had not done so, and as soon as they heard the firing, their captain ordered them to discharge their pieces. Company C led the 16th, Colonel Irvin, at the head of our column, and hearing the rapid discharge of musketry on our left, and supposing the secessionists to be over the brow of the hill, he ordered us to stop and load, which we did in a twinkling. Supposing the cannon which we saw on a hill west of town to be worked by the secessionists, I suppose we would be commanded to charge, so I ordered the men to unsling their knapsacks and throw them in the fence corner and detailed a guard to watch them. By this time, the rear of the Virginians, the 1st Virginia Regiment, were about 50 yards in our advance when the command forwards double quick was given, and away we went on the run. Although Company C had carried more luggage than any other company, they came up in solid column, leaving the other companies in the rear. The surgeon of the regiment rode up and said, "Do you hear the cannonballs whistling?" And sure enough, immediately after each flash, we could distinctly hear the whizzing. Colonel Kelly was shot in the shoulder just as we came up the street. We came out on the northeast of the town, and as we later learned, the 14th Ohio, the 7th Indiana, and a battery, having entered Virginia by the Parkersburg Railroad, were acting in concert with us and had taken their position west of town. So he goes on, and basically they run through town and chase the Confederates out the other side, and that's the first land battle of the Civil War. But there were guys from Yellow Springs there. This is a view of down the mountains of Philippi. The artillery battery thinks is Confederate. It actually turns out to be an Indiana battery. And here they are marching through the town of Philippi with those mountains behind it. And of course what this led to was a further campaign, but the successful secession of the western counties of Virginia from Virginia to form the state of West Virginia during the Civil War. This is Secession Hall at Wheeling, which still stands. Their constitutional convention. Well, back home in Xenia, the recruiting is going on because Lincoln has now called for 300,000 troops to serve for 3 years after the Battle of Bull Run. This is a 1850s view of the railroad stations. William Mills, who had lost his home and lost his fortune at this point, joined the regiment that was going to be known as the Greene County Regiment, became the 74th Ohio Infantry. Almost all from Greene County. This is the Silver Creek Rifles and from Jamestown, company from Jamestown at the fairgrounds in Xenia. Really rare. This happens to be another town. This is Akron, but it shows the same thing that was going on all over Ohio with infantry regiments being raised. I put this in here. This is the mill that was at Old Town on 68, and as the 74th is training. And remember, all these experiences are new for these guys, and so they're writing about things that later in the war they'd never even mentioned. But it was apparently an exciting march. They marched out from the fairgrounds in Xenia to the mill and back to Xenia. They make a point of so that's Massey's Creek, the covered bridge. Then there's the 5th Ohio Cavalry. Another regiment. It was being the federal government didn't really want cavalry. The state didn't really want cavalry, but an officer in Cincinnati wanted to raise a cavalry regiment. He finally found General Fremont out in Missouri, who would accept a cavalry regiment. So he started raising a cavalry regiment in southwest Ohio, which eventually Fremont was sort of cashiered out of the Army, and the Governor Dennison, decides to take the 5th Ohio, or what became the 5th Ohio Cavalry. It was actually the 2nd Ohio Cavalry Regiment initially, and then through some confusion changed the numbers. But mostly from Hamilton County, one company raised by James Hyde from Miami Township. But these are for the guys. I don't know what the guy in the middle is doing with this, modeling the headgear, I guess. Here's another regiment. This poor cavalry regiment, because the state didn't have any cavalry equipment, they had not enough. There were 1,200 men in a cavalry regiment. They had started off with 800 swords, like 150 carbines, and a couple hundred pistols. So they couldn't even arm the whole regiment.
Could they bring their own horses?
They gave them horses. They had horses for them, and you wouldn't want to take your own horse because the chances are you're going to lose it. So this is a man by the name of, it's not a very good picture, but William Baker from Yellow Springs, who was in the 5th Ohio Cavalry. Another regiment, which we'll talk about, or a unit from this area, 10th Ohio Battery. We'll talk about that some other time in more detail. 44th Infantry, which I haven't mentioned because it's another, there was a whole company raised in Yellow Springs for that regiment. We'll save that for another time, as we will the 110th Ohio, which had a number of men from Yellow Springs, including James Fox, who was killed. 2 bands raised in Yellow Springs. One for which was really unusual for a town of 1,300 people. This isn't one of them, but it's an example of what a Civil War band looks like, because they had their instruments, the openings go to the back rather than the front, because they're in the front and the soldiers are going behind them, so they've got to hear it. So the bells are reversed. But one for the 44th Infantry, and then another for the 74th Infantry, which for some reason, mainly because in 1862, I think the federal government outlawed having each regiment having its own band. This is the band of the 44th. And they managed to keep theirs. They paid for it themselves. The federal government wouldn't pay for it anymore. But the 74th band, which had a lot of Yellow Springs guys in it, all became part of the 1st Kentucky for some reason. There's a regimental flag of the 1st Kentucky. It was mostly Ohioans anyway. In Yellow Springs, I wanted to take a couple of minutes to explain what was going on here. And we'll come back to the 5th Cavalry in a second. We had the resorts. This is the Yellow Springs house. That was the Neff house, which was a private residence at the time of the Civil War. And the water cure, which would burn in 1862. But an unusual thing is we had a number of Civil War generals' families who came to the Yellow Springs for the duration of the war. One was Rosecrans' family, who lived in this house right here, which the owners are with us. They had, Anne was the name of General Rosecrans' wife, who was here with her children. And there was a child, Charlotte, who was both born and died in Yellow Springs of whooping cough. Sharing the same house was a family of this man, Eliakim Scammon. And they'd had connections going back before the Civil War. His wife, Margaret, and his daughter, Margaret, same name, would marry a man by the name of Walter Lockwood after the war in September 1865 in Yellow Springs, with the wedding officiated over by Rosecrans' brother, who was auxiliary bishop of Cincinnati during the Civil War and became bishop of Columbus, Catholic bishop of Columbus. This was a window, a pane from the house. You see Rosecrans. It is right there. There's the brother, Sylvester. Another man I found by accident who was here, Thomas Kilby Smith, became a general. He was a clerk of Hamilton County before the Civil War, and he's riding on his horse there. He's not a cavalryman, he's an infantryman, 54th Ohio. 54th Ohio was a Zouave regiment, meaning they wore these fezzes and baggy pants, and it was a French. The Zouave regiment had been a French regiment in Algeria, and it was the rage at the beginning of the Civil War, and there were two Zouave regiments raised in Ohio. This is the 34th, he's the 54th of those two regiments raised in Ohio. You see them with their fezzes. This is his wife, Anna Maria. No, excuse me. His wife's name was Elizabeth, and his mother Eliza lived here with her, and Eliza was, I think, probably any Army officer's worst nightmare of a mother, because she vaguely knew Sherman's wife from someplace, and Sherman was Kilby Smith's commanding officer. So she kept writing to Sherman saying that her son wasn't being promoted fast enough. Yeah. And amazingly enough, Sherman responded, and it's like, come on. His record is perfect, his habits excellent, his health good, his bravery is a little rash, his judgment good, and all he needs is hard study of books and men. I mean, of course, military textbook of men who compose large armies. That was one of Sherman's responses, of several responses. And another time, she's apparently saying, "I'd like to meet your wife, see your wife, and I am pleased to note that you are acquainted with Mrs. Sherman, but our children are at that age that requires her personal care, so that I fear she will not find it convenient to accept your kind invitation to the Springs. Yet she can do as she likes." And in reading this book on Kilby Smith's life, I found then at least two more generals whose wives or whose families lived here. One of them was this man, David Stanley, who was a really well-known commander, especially later in the Civil War in the Army of the Cumberland. He'd actually grown up in Wayne County, which is where I'm from originally. He received the Congressional Medal of Honor for leading a charge at the Battle of Franklin in the Civil War. I thought, could it possibly be that he actually was in Yellow Springs? It didn't seem to have any connection, but I found the wonders of the internet and Google. A New York Times article from December 3rd, 1864, and says, Major General D.S. Stanley left here by mailboat for his home in Yellow Springs, Ohio this afternoon. So he was definitely here, and I found a photograph of his wife, Anna Maria, and his daughter Anna, who was born in Yellow Springs, and in April 18th, 1864. And she would go on, she would marry another military man, actually became a major general, and became really an internationally known painter. And even more eerily, died in Chester, Pennsylvania, which is where the other Yellow Springs is located. So. Okay, I said I'd get us back to the 5th here, 5th Ohio Cavalry, and I just want to point out that if you take a look, this is obviously eastern United States, Cumberland River, the Tennessee River. You need to supply your troops. If you want to go into the Deep South, you really got to control the Tennessee River. And so General Grant was moving on, and Sherman were moving on the both of those rivers, but primarily Tennessee. They'd taken Fort Donelson at the mouth near the Ohio, and a little place called Shiloh Church on the banks of the river. It's Pittsburgh Landing. You'll hear the battle called Pittsburgh Landing sometime, and that was the actual landing on the Tennessee River. Shiloh Church was inland for a while in a ways, and the 5th Ohio Cavalry was actively involved in Shiloh. Shiloh was a incredibly hard-fought, bloody clash, probably the hardest battle of the Civil War up to this point. And the thing that people said is the South never smiled again after Shiloh because they realized what they were in for on their side. They're not labeled as the 5th Ohio Cavalry, but I like to think that's the 5th Ohio Cavalry, including the company, James Hyde's company from Yellow Springs. Shiloh Church in the background. There's a monument to the 5th Ohio Cavalry in the 3 battalions. Well, this is sort of a fitting place to end our discussion of the first year of the war, because it may have been that Yellow Springs didn't quite smile as much either after Shiloh, because there were at least 3 men, maybe 4 men from Yellow Springs who were killed or died of disease in the couple of weeks around this battle of Shiloh. One of them was James Hyde, the captain who was commanding the regiment. This is his monument from the family monument from Glen Forest, and if you make it out there, he was born August 14th, 1829, died Pittsburgh Landing, Tennessee, June 3rd, 1862. This is his actual, he's not buried here, at least I assume he's not buried here. This is his monument at Shiloh Battlefield National Military Park. J.G. Lawrence, this is Glen Forest Cemetery, died May 8th, 1862, aged 23 years, 2 days. He died for his country. And 2 others, Thomas Goldthwait, who was killed in a skirmish right before the Battle of Shiloh, April 4th, 1862, and a man by the name of A.A. Norton, who died June 12th, 1862, was 50 when he was in this. So that's the beginning of the Civil War, probably more than you wanted to know, and how it affected Yellow Springs in Ohio. So, any questions?
You had mentioned earlier that Cedarville was a hotbed of pro-slavery forces. Was there any particular reason for that?
My guess is, if you think about, if you remember my presentation on mapping and the Little Miami River being the dividing line between the land between the Miami Survey and the Virginia Military District, and Cedarville's in the Virginia Military District, and a lot of that land was given to Virginia veterans of the Revolutionary War. So my guess is, I never really looked at it to prove that it's true. My guess is there were more southern originated settlers in that part of the county than there is on our side of the Little Magnet River. And my guess is that's part of it. Plus, they're just backwards. Tom?
In reading Uncle Tom's Cabin, they make the same statement about slaves trying to reach Canada to escape the jurisdiction of the federal government. Do you have any inkling what became of most of those people who reached Canada? Did they remain in Canada, or did they eventually return?
I think a lot of them did remain in Canada. I know I've read accounts of some coming back. I don't know if there's been any studies done of exactly, what percentages or where they settled in Canada, or how they how their families have continued. I don't know, but I know some of them did, and then because in Anne Hagedorn's book, she also talks about some coming back to that area, and they would actually see again the people that helped them along the underground.
That's exactly what I thought was.
Yeah.
The conductors ever meet the people they had helped?
Apparently it wasn't very common, but it happened at least a few times, because she mentions that there are accounts of it. So.
Thank you.
Anything else? Thanks for everybody's patience.
Oh.